Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The summer of 1987 stretched endlessly before me, filled with the promise of freedom that only a 10-year-old could truly appreciate. I lived in rural Indiana, where cornfields stretched like green oceans in every direction, and the nearest neighbor was close enough to borrow sugar, but far enough away to mind their own business. Our small town of Cedar Falls was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the local diner served coffee that could wake the dead, and where the biggest excitement usually came from the high school football games or the annual corn festival. That particular Saturday in July started like any other. The morning air was thick with humidity that made your clothes stick to your skin, and the cicadas had already begun their relentless buzzing symphony in the trees. My older brother Timothy was scheduled to play in a travel baseball tournament 2 towns over in Millfield, and I was expected to tag along as usual. At 15, Timothy was the star pitcher of our local team, and my parents never missed one of his games. I remember feeling restless that morning, the way children do when they're forced to sit still for too long. The thought of spending 3 hours on those splintered wooden bleachers, pretending to care about strikes and balls, made my stomach churn with boredom. But there was no getting out of it. Family was family. And in our house, that meant showing up for each other, no matter what. The drive to Millfield took 45 minutes through winding country roads, lined with farmhouses and barns that had seen better decades. My father drove our old Ford pickup, its air conditioning long since broken, while my mother fanned herself with a church bulletin. The radio crackled with static, playing country music that seemed to fade in and out like a ghost trying to communicate. As we pulled into the dusty parking lot beside the baseball diamond, I could see families already gathering. Coolers full of ice-cold drinks, folding chairs arranged in perfect rows, and children running around with the boundless energy that adults envied. The smell of grilled hot dogs and hamburgers wafted through the air from the concession stand, mixing with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint odor of livestock from nearby farms. The baseball field itself was nothing special, just a patch of maintained grass surrounded by a chain-link fence, with those notorious pine bleachers that had given me splinters more times than I could count. Behind the field, about 100 yards away, stood a playground that looked like it had been installed sometime in the 1970s. The equipment was sturdy but weathered, painted in colors that had faded under years of harsh summer sun. What caught my attention immediately was the tree line that bordered the entire area. Dense wood stretched back as far as the eye could see, creating a natural wall of green that seemed to swallow the horizon. Something about those trees felt different from the familiar woods around our home. They seemed darker somehow, more secretive, as if they were hiding something important just beyond where anyone could see. Timothy jogged onto the field with his teammates, his uniform crisp and clean, his glove well-oiled and ready for action. I watched him take his practice throws, noting the confidence in his movements, the easy way he commanded respect from the other players. Part of me felt proud to be his little brother, but another part felt the familiar sting of inadequacy that came from always being in someone else's shadow. The game began with the usual fanfare. The national anthem played through a crackling PA system, followed by the ceremonial first pitch thrown by the mayor of Millfield, a heavy-set man whose claim to fame was winning the county fair pie-eating contest 3 years running. As the opposing team took their positions, I tried to settle in for what I knew would be a long afternoon, but my attention kept wandering to that playground behind the field. I could see children my age running around, their laughter carrying across the distance like music. They seemed to be having actual fun, unlike the adults who sat rigidly in their chairs, shouting instructions that the players couldn't hear and keeping score in little notebooks as if their lives depended on it. By the 3rd inning, my restlessness had reached a breaking point. The sun was beating down mercilessly, and the wooden bleacher beneath me felt like it was slowly cooking my legs through my jeans. When I asked my father if I could go play on the playground, he barely looked up from his scorecard before nodding absently. "Stay where I can see you," he said, his eyes never leaving the field where Timothy was preparing to pitch. I practically flew off those bleachers, my feet hitting the ground with a satisfying thump. The walk to the playground felt like a journey to freedom, each step taking me further away from the tedious world of adult expectations and closer to the simple joy of just being a kid. As I got closer, I could hear the specific sounds of childhood play, the creak of swing set chains, the hollow thump of feet on metal slides, and the rapid-fire chatter of children lost in their own imaginary worlds. The playground was more crowded than it had appeared from a distance. Kids of all ages scrambled over the equipment like busy ants, their energy infectious and immediate. I recognized a few faces from other baseball teams in our league, children I'd seen at previous tournaments but never really talked to. There was something liberating about being in a place where nobody knew exactly who I was or what was expected of me. I threw myself into the playground activities with the desperate enthusiasm of someone who had been trapped in adult world for far too long. I climbed the monkey bars until my palms were raw, raced down the twisting slide until the static electricity made my hair stand on end, and joined an impromptu game of tag that stretched across every piece of equipment in the area. The other children were welcoming in the way that kids can be when they're all united in the common goal of having fun. We invented elaborate games on the spot, created alliances that lasted for minutes before dissolving into new configurations, and shared the kind of laughter that comes from deep in your belly and bubbles up without warning. For a while, I forgot completely about the baseball game happening behind me. I forgot about Timothy and his perfect pitching form, about my parents keeping careful score, about the expectations that seemed to follow me everywhere I went. In that playground, surrounded by children who didn't know or care about any of that, I was just a kid playing in the summer sun. But even in that moment of pure childhood joy, something felt slightly off. Maybe it was the way the trees behind the playground seemed to lean inward, as if they were listening to our games. Maybe it was the occasional shadow that moved differently than it should have among the branches. Or maybe it was just the natural wariness that some children develop early. A sixth sense that warns them when something isn't quite right. Whatever it was, I found myself glancing toward those woods more often than I probably should have. Each time I looked, they seemed a little darker, a little more mysterious. And each time I turned back to the game, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in those trees was looking back at me. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the crowd on the playground gradually thinned out. Some children were called back to their families for snacks or bathroom breaks. Others simply grew tired of the games and wandered off to explore different areas of the park. By the time the baseball game entered its sixth inning, only about half a dozen of us remained actively playing. That's when he appeared. I first noticed him standing at the edge of the playground, just beyond the safety zone of wood chips and painted equipment. He was older than the rest of us, definitely a teenager, maybe 17 or 18 years old. Tall and lean, with curly brown hair that caught the late afternoon sunlight in a way that made it look almost golden. His clothes were casual but clean, faded jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days but wasn't dirty or torn. What struck me most about him was his smile. It was the kind of smile that seemed genuine and friendly, the sort that immediately made you want to trust the person wearing it. He had an easy, relaxed way of standing that suggested confidence without arrogance, and when he finally approached our group, his voice was warm and conversational. "Hey there," he said, addressing all of us but somehow making it feel like he was speaking to each of us individually. "You guys having fun over here? I could hear you laughing from way over by the concession stand." The other children responded with the natural enthusiasm that kids show when an older, cooler person pays attention to them. They gathered around him like iron filings drawn to a magnet, eager to share stories about their games and show off whatever playground skills they had mastered that afternoon. His name was Brett, or at least that's what he told us. He said he was visiting relatives in the area and had been watching the baseball game when he noticed our playground activities. He had a way of talking that made even the most mundane topics seem interesting, and he asked questions that made each of us feel important and heard. "I used to love playgrounds when I was your age," he said, settling down on one of the park benches in a way that brought him to our eye level. "But you know what I discovered when I got older? The really cool stuff isn't on the playground, it's out there." He gestured vaguely toward the tree line behind us. "What kind of stuff?" asked Jenny, a freckled girl from the Millfield team who had been dominating the monkey bars all afternoon. Brett's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly that question. "Oh, all kinds of things. Hidden places that most people never find. Old buildings that have been abandoned for years. Sometimes you can find really interesting stuff in places like that." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make us all lean in closer. "Actually, I know some pretty crazy stories about this area. Stuff that happened right around here, not too far from where we're sitting right now." The effect was immediate and electric. Nothing captures a child's attention quite like the promise of scary stories, especially when they're told by someone old enough to be credible, but young enough to still seem approachable. We formed a tight semicircle around Brett, our earlier games completely forgotten. "What kind of stories?" asked Tommy, a boy from our own team who had a reputation for being braver than his size suggested. Brett looked around dramatically, as if checking to make sure no adults were close enough to overhear. The gesture was theatrical, but effective. It made us all feel like we were being let in on something secret and important. "Well," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. "There's this old cabin up in those woods behind us. Been there for probably 50 years or more. Most people don't even know it exists because it's pretty well hidden, and the path to get there isn't marked or anything." He paused, letting the anticipation build. I found myself leaning forward unconsciously, drawn into his narrative despite myself. "The story goes that there were these two brothers who lived in that cabin back in the 1960s. They inherited it from their father, who had built it as a hunting lodge. But these brothers, they didn't get along very well. In fact, they hated each other's guts." Brett's voice dropped even lower, forcing us to strain to hear every word. "They fought about everything: money, women, who was supposed to take care of their sick mother. But the worst fight they ever had was over this girl they both wanted to marry. She was supposedly the prettiest girl in 3 counties, and both brothers were absolutely crazy about her." The story continued, growing darker and more violent with each detail. Brett described how the brothers' arguments had escalated from shouting matches to physical fights, how they had eventually started threatening each other with farm tools and hunting equipment. He painted vivid pictures of their final confrontation, when they had supposedly attacked each other with axes and shovels in a rage-fueled battle that left both of them dead. "They say you can still see the bloodstains on the cabin walls," Brett concluded, his voice barely above a whisper. "And sometimes on really quiet nights, you can hear them still arguing, still fighting over that girl who never chose either one of them." The effect of his story was exactly what he had probably intended. Some of the younger children looked genuinely frightened, their eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and terror. Others seemed skeptical but intrigued, the way kids get when they're not sure whether to believe something but don't want to miss out on the excitement. As for me, I found myself caught somewhere between those two reactions. Part of me recognized that Brett was probably just telling tall tales, the kind of local legends that every small town seemed to accumulate over the years. But another part of me, the part that had been noticing those shadows in the trees all afternoon, wondered if there might be some truth to his story. "Have you ever been to this cabin?" asked Jenny, her voice carrying a note of challenge that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Brett smiled that same warm, trustworthy smile. "Oh yeah, several times. It's actually not that hard to find once you know where to look. The hardest part is just working up the courage to go inside. He stood up from the bench, stretching casually as if the conversation had been nothing more than idle entertainment. But I'm guessing you guys are probably too young for that kind of adventure. It's pretty scary, even for someone like me. The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. To a group of children who had spent the afternoon proving their bravery on playground equipment, the suggestion that they might be too scared for a real adventure was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. "We're not scared," Tommy declared, speaking for the group with the kind of bravado that 10-year-olds specialize in. "Maybe not," Brett said with a knowing smile, "but your parents probably wouldn't be too happy if they found out you were wandering off into the woods. And besides, it's getting pretty late in the day. The sun will be setting soon." As if summoned by his words, several parents appeared at various points around the playground, calling for their children to return to the baseball game or gather their belongings for the trip home. One by one, my new playground friends began to drift away, pulled back into the orbit of family responsibilities and scheduled activities. Jenny waved goodbye as her mother led her toward their car. Tommy was summoned by his father to help carry a cooler to their truck. Within minutes, the playground that had been bustling with activity was nearly empty, which left just Brett and me, standing in the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, with nothing but the distant sounds of the baseball game and the ever-present whisper of wind through the trees. "Well," Brett said, turning that charming smile directly on me, "I guess it's just you and me now." The playground felt eerily different with just the two of us there. What had seemed like a vibrant, safe space just minutes before now felt exposed and vulnerable. The equipment that had been so welcoming during the afternoon's games now cast long shadows that stretched toward the tree line like dark fingers reaching across the wood chips. Brett seemed completely at ease with the change in atmosphere. If anything, he appeared more relaxed now that the other children had left, as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment. He settled back onto the park bench with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, even though something deep in my gut was starting to whisper that maybe he didn't. "So," he said, his voice maintaining that same friendly tone that had drawn us all in earlier. "What's your name?" "I don't think you mentioned it before." "Connor," I replied, though I immediately wondered if I should have given him a fake name instead. The thought surprised me. Where had that come from? This was just a friendly teenager who had been entertaining us with stories. There was no reason to be suspicious of him. "Connor," he repeated, as if testing how the name sounded. "That's a good, strong name. Irish, right? I bet you're tougher than you look." The compliment should have made me feel good, but instead it sent an odd chill through my chest. There was something about the way he said it that felt less like a casual observation and more like an assessment. The way someone might evaluate a piece of merchandise they were considering purchasing. "I should probably get back to the baseball game," I said, glancing over my shoulder toward the field where I could see my parents still sitting in the bleachers. They looked impossibly far away, even though the distance couldn't have been more than 100 yards. "Oh, come on," Brett said with a laugh that sounded forced around the edges. "The game's almost over anyway. Besides, don't you want to hear more about that cabin I was telling you about? I've got some really interesting details that I didn't want to share in front of the little kids." Despite every instinct telling me to walk away, I found myself curious about what he might tell me. There was something compelling about being treated like I was old enough to handle more mature information, something flattering about being singled out from the group for special attention. "What kind of details?" I asked, though I took a small step backward as I spoke, creating a little more distance between us. Brett's eyes lit up with apparent enthusiasm. "Well, for starters, those brothers I told you about. The story doesn't end with them just dying in that cabin. See, after they were found dead, some really strange things started happening in the area." He leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Kids would go missing from this very playground. Not all at once, and not in any pattern that people could figure out. Just one here, one there, always children who had wandered off by themselves. My mouth went dry. What happened to them? Some of them were never found, Brett said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine sadness. But the ones who did turn up, well, they were different. Changed. They couldn't really explain what had happened to them, but they were never quite the same afterward. He stood up from the bench, moving slowly but purposefully in my direction. The thing is, Connor, I think those missing kids were taken to that cabin. I think someone has been using it as a hiding place, a place where they could spend time with children without being interrupted. The way he said those words, spend time with children, made my skin crawl. There was an implication in his tone that I couldn't quite grasp, but that my instincts recognized as dangerous. Every muscle in my body was suddenly tense, ready to run, though I couldn't have explained why. I really should go back to my parents, I said, trying to keep my voice steady and normal. They'll be wondering where I am. Will they, though? Brett asked, tilting his head slightly. I've been watching for a while, and they seem pretty focused on that baseball game. I bet they haven't even looked over here in the last 30 minutes. The fact that he had been watching my family without my knowledge sent a spike of fear through my chest. How long had he been observing us? What else had he noticed that I hadn't been aware of? The thing about that cabin, Brett continued, taking another step closer, is that it's really not that far from here. Maybe a 10-minute walk through the woods. And I've been thinking it might be fun to show it to someone who's brave enough to appreciate it. I'm not really interested, I said, backing away more obviously now. Thanks anyway. But Brett's smile never wavered. Oh, I think you are interested. I think you're exactly the kind of kid who would love to see something that most people never get to experience. You seem different from those other children. More mature, more adventurous. There was something hypnotic about his voice, something that made it hard to think clearly. Part of me was terrified and wanted nothing more than to run back to the safety of my parents and the baseball game. But another part, a part I didn't like or understand, was curious about what he was offering. Come on, Connor, Brett said, extending his hand toward me in what looked like a friendly gesture. Just a quick look. We'll be back before the game is over. Your parents will never even know you were gone. I stared at his outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity. It looked normal enough. Clean fingernails, no obvious scars or marks, nothing that screamed danger. But something about it repulsed me on a level I couldn't articulate. The idea of touching him, of making any kind of physical contact, filled me with revulsion. I really can't, I said, continuing to back away. My dad is really strict about staying where he can see me. For just a moment, Brett's mask seemed to slip. His smile faltered slightly, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. It was gone so quickly that I might have imagined it, but the glimpse was enough to confirm what my instincts had been screaming all along. This person was dangerous. That's too bad, Brett said, his smile returning but not quite reaching his eyes this time. I was really hoping to share something special with you. The cabin is actually fascinating from a historical perspective. And the view from up there is incredible. You can see for miles in every direction. He gestured toward the tree line, and for the first time, I noticed a faint path leading into the woods. It was barely visible, just a slight depression in the undergrowth that suggested people had walked that way before, but not recently. It's really just right over that first hill, Brett continued. 5 minutes up, 5 minutes to look around, 5 minutes back. Your parents would never even know you were gone. The repetition of that phrase, your parents would never even know you were gone, sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Why was he so focused on making sure my parents wouldn't notice my absence? Why was that such an important part of his invitation? No, I said, more firmly this time. I'm going back to the game now. I turned and started walking toward the baseball field. my legs feeling shaky and uncertain beneath me. Every step felt like it took tremendous effort, as if I was walking through thick mud instead of across a level playground. Behind me, I could hear Brett's voice calling out, still maintaining that friendly tone, but with something else underneath it now. Something that sounded like frustration or anger, barely held in check. "That's okay, Connor," he called after me. "Maybe some other time. I'll probably be around this area quite a bit over the next few weeks. I'm sure we'll run into each other again." The threat in those words was subtle, but unmistakable. He wasn't just saying goodbye, he was making a promise, or maybe a threat. The idea that he might be looking for me, waiting for another opportunity, made my knees weak with fear. I forced myself to keep walking, not looking back, focusing all my attention on reaching the safety of the baseball game and my parents. But with every step, I could feel his eyes on me, watching, evaluating, planning. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was whispering that this wasn't over. Despite my better judgment and the growing knot of fear in my stomach, I found myself slowing down before I reached the baseball field. Something about Brett's confident assertion that my parents hadn't been watching was nagging at me. When I finally turned to look back at the bleachers, my heart sank. He was right. My parents were completely absorbed in the game, leaning forward in their seats as Timothy prepared for what appeared to be a crucial pitch. My father was shouting encouragement that I couldn't hear over the distance, while my mother clutched her scorecard with white knuckles. Neither of them was even facing in my direction. The realization hit me like a physical blow. In their minds, I was probably still safely playing on the playground, supervised by the general presence of other families and the open, public nature of the space. They had no idea that I was now completely alone with a stranger who had been watching our family for who knows how long. When I turned back toward the playground, Brett was no longer sitting on the bench. For a moment, I felt a rush of relief, thinking that maybe he had given up and wandered off to find some other target for his attention. But then I spotted him, standing at the very edge of the tree line, right where that faint path disappeared into the woods. He was facing my direction, and even at that distance, I could see that he was smiling. But this wasn't the warm, friendly smile he had worn earlier. This was something else entirely. Predatory, confident, patient. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen next. And the most terrifying part was that he was right. Despite every rational thought in my head screaming at me to run back to my parents, despite the fear that was making my hands shake and my mouth taste like copper, I found myself walking back toward the playground. Each step felt like it was happening to someone else, as if I was watching myself from a distance, unable to intervene in my own terrible decision. "I knew you'd come back," Brett said when I was close enough to hear him clearly. His voice carried a note of satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "You're exactly the kind of kid I thought you were. Curious, brave, mature enough to handle something really special." "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said, though my voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to my own ears. "Of course not," Brett replied with that same disturbing smile. "I wouldn't expect you to just trust a stranger. That would be dangerous, wouldn't it?" The fact that he was acknowledging the danger while simultaneously trying to lure me into it was deeply unsettling. It suggested a level of psychological sophistication that I wasn't equipped to handle, a kind of manipulation that was specifically designed to overcome a child's natural defenses. "But here's the thing, Connor," he continued, taking a step closer to the tree line and gesturing for me to follow. "I'm not really a stranger anymore, am I? We've been talking for almost an hour now. You know my name, I know yours. We've shared stories, had some laughs. That's what friends do." The word friends sent a chill down my spine. There was something fundamentally wrong about the way he used it, something that turned what should have been a warm, positive concept into something threatening and possessive. Besides, Brett said, pointing into the woods. I'm not asking you to go anywhere dangerous or isolated. That cabin I told you about, it's literally just over this hill. 5 minutes up, 5 minutes to look around, 5 minutes back. We'll be in sight of this field the whole time. I looked where he was pointing and realized that he might be telling the truth about the distance. The hill he was indicating wasn't particularly tall or steep, and the tree cover, while dense, wasn't impenetrable. If we really were only going a short distance, and if we really would be able to see the baseball field the whole time, then maybe it wouldn't be as dangerous as my instincts were telling me. You can even tell your parents where you're going if you want, Brett added, as if reading my thoughts. Go over there right now and let them know you're taking a quick walk in the woods with a friend. I'll wait right here. But we both knew I wasn't going to do that. If I told my parents what Brett was suggesting, they would shut it down immediately. No responsible adult would allow their 10-year-old child to wander off into the woods with a teenager they had never met, no matter how short the distance or how innocent the stated purpose. The fact that Brett was suggesting it while knowing full well that I wouldn't actually do it was another layer of manipulation. He was giving me an out that he knew I wouldn't take, which would make me feel like I was choosing to come with him rather than being coerced. Come on, Brett said, his voice taking on a slightly impatient edge. The sun's going to set soon, and then it really will be too dark to see anything. This is probably the only chance you'll get. He started walking slowly up the path, not looking back to see if I was following, but moving in a way that clearly expected me to come along. Each step he took into the woods seemed to pull at something inside me, like an invisible rope that was slowly drawing me forward against my will. I stood at the edge of the tree line for what felt like an eternity, my rational mind at war with forces I didn't understand. Everything logical told me to turn around, walk back to the baseball game, find my parents, and report what had happened. But something else. Something that might have been curiosity or bravado, or just the natural rebelliousness of childhood, was urging me to follow. Connor, Brett called from about 20 feet up the path, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space of the woods. You coming? And God help me, I was. The first few steps into the woods felt like crossing an invisible barrier. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as soon as the canopy of leaves blocked out the direct sunlight, and the sounds of the baseball game became muffled and distant. The path was narrower than it had appeared from the playground, barely wide enough for one person, and lined with thorny bushes that seemed to reach out and grab at my clothes as I passed. Brett moved ahead of me with the confidence of someone who had walked this route many times before. He navigated around fallen logs and protruding roots without even looking down, his attention focused somewhere ahead that I couldn't see. Occasionally he would glance back at me with that same unsettling smile, as if checking to make sure I was still following. This is actually a pretty interesting ecosystem, he said conversationally, as if we were on a nature walk rather than something that felt increasingly like a terrible mistake. Lots of wildlife up here that you don't see down in the developed areas. Deer, wild turkeys, even the occasional black bear, though they usually stay away from people. The mention of bears sent a fresh spike of anxiety through my chest. I had never encountered a wild bear before, and the idea of running into one while alone in the woods with a near stranger was terrifying. Don't worry, Brett said, apparently noticing my expression. Bears are actually more afraid of you than you are of them. As long as you don't surprise them or get between a mother and her cubs, they'll usually just avoid you entirely. We continued climbing, the path growing steeper and more difficult with each step. My legs were starting to burn from the exertion, and I was beginning to breathe hard in the humid air. But Brett seemed unaffected by the climb, maintaining the same steady pace he had started with. How much further? I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. Not far now, Brett replied without turning around. Just over this next rise. But when we reached the top of what I thought was the final hill, I realized we weren't even close to our destination. Ahead of us, the path continued to wind through the trees, sometimes climbing, sometimes descending, but always leading deeper into the woods and further away from the safety of the baseball field. I stopped walking and looked back the way we had come. Through the trees, I could still see glimpses of the open field where the game was taking place, but it looked much further away than I had expected. The small figures of the players and spectators seemed impossibly distant, like looking at people through the wrong end of a telescope. "Brett," I called out, my voice cracking slightly with fear. "You said it was just over the hill. We've been walking for more than 5 minutes." He stopped and turned back to face me, and for a moment, his mask slipped completely. The friendly expression was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. But then, just as quickly, the smile returned. "Sorry, Connor," he said, his voice still maintaining that false warmth. "I guess I misjudged the distance a little bit. It's been a while since I've been up here. But we're really close now. Maybe just another 5 minutes. Another 5 minutes that would take us even deeper into the woods, even further from help, even more isolated from any potential witnesses or rescuers." The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around and run, but somehow I couldn't make my legs obey the command. "I think I want to go back," I said, though my voice sounded small and uncertain. "Go back?" Brett asked, tilting his head with what looked like genuine surprise. "But we're so close, Connor. It would be a shame to come all this way and not see what we came for." He took a step closer to me, and I noticed for the first time how much larger he was than me. He wasn't exceptionally tall or muscular, but he was a teenager, and I was just a 10-year-old boy. If he decided he didn't want me to leave, there probably wasn't much I could do to stop him. "Besides," he continued, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge, "the path back down is tricky in some places. It would be safer if I went with you, and I really did want to show you this cabin first. It's truly something special." The implied threat was clear. He wasn't going to let me leave alone, and he wasn't ready to turn back yet. I was trapped in the woods with someone who had lied to me about where we were going and how long it would take to get there. Someone who had been watching my family, without our knowledge. Someone who seemed far too interested in getting a 10-year-old boy alone and isolated. And the most terrifying realization of all was that my parents had no idea where I was, or who I was with. If something happened to me up here, they wouldn't even know where to start looking. "Okay," I whispered. Because what else could I say? "Just a quick look and then we go back." Brett's smile widened, and this time there was no mistaking the predatory satisfaction in his expression. "Of course," he said. "Just a quick look." The cabin appeared suddenly, emerging from the dense foliage like something out of a nightmare. One moment we were walking through what seemed like endless forest, and the next we were standing in a small clearing where the trees had been cut back to make room for a structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. It was smaller than I had expected, maybe the size of a large garage, and built from logs that had weathered to a dark, almost black color. The roof sagged ominously in the middle, covered with moss and what looked like decades of accumulated leaves and debris. Several of the windows were broken, their glass hanging in jagged shards that caught the filtered sunlight like broken teeth. But what struck me most about the cabin wasn't its decrepit condition. It was the smell. Even from 20 feet away, I could detect an odor that made my stomach turn. It was a combination of rot and dampness and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify, but that made every instinct in my body scream danger. "Well," Brett said, his voice carrying that same false cheerfulness that had become increasingly unsettling as our journey progressed. "Here we are. What do you think?" I thought it was the most terrifying place I had ever seen. There was something fundamentally wrong about the cabin, something that went beyond its obvious state of disrepair. It felt evil, if such a thing was possible for a building to feel. It radiated menace the way a fire radiates heat, creating an almost physical sensation of dread that made my skin crawl. "It's creepy," I managed to say, which was perhaps the greatest understatement of my young life. "Creepy is right," Brett agreed, but his tone suggested he found that quality appealing rather than disturbing. "Want to take a closer look?" Every fiber of my being wanted to say no, wanted to turn around and run back down that path as fast as my legs could carry me. But something about Brett's demeanor had changed since we'd arrived at the clearing. The pretense of friendly conversation had dropped away almost entirely, replaced by something more direct and intimidating. "I don't think so," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we should head back now. The game is probably almost over." Brett turned to look at me, and the expression on his face made my blood freeze in my veins. The mask of friendliness had been completely abandoned now, revealing something underneath that was cold and calculating and utterly without empathy. "Oh, I don't think we need to worry about the game," he said quietly. "I think we have plenty of time to explore." He started walking toward the cabin, not bothering to check if I was following. But something about his movement suggested he wasn't particularly worried about whether I came with him or not. Maybe because he knew there was nowhere for me to run, or maybe because he was confident that I wouldn't try to leave without him. As he approached the front door, which hung at an odd angle on rusted hinges, Brett reached into his pocket and pulled out something that glinted in the filtered sunlight. For a moment, I thought it might be a key, but as he got closer to the door, I realized it was something much more sinister. It was a knife. Not a large knife. Nothing that would have been immediately threatening if I had seen it in any other context. Just a small folding knife. The kind that hunters or outdoorsmen might carry for utility purposes. But seeing it in Brett's hand, in this isolated location, with the way his entire demeanor had changed, transformed it into something genuinely terrifying. "Brett," I said, my voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "What are you doing?" He paused at the cabin door and looked back at me with what might have been amusement. "Just making sure we can get inside safely, Connor. Old buildings like this can be dangerous. Lots of rusty nails and unstable boards. I want to check it out first before you come in." But the way he held the knife, the way his fingers wrapped around it with obvious familiarity, suggested that he had much more experience with the tool than would be needed for simple building inspection. The cabin door opened with a shriek of protesting metal that echoed through the clearing like a scream. Even from where I stood, I could see into the dark interior of the building, and what I saw there made my knees go weak with terror. The inside of the cabin was a horror show. What had once been walls were now covered in dark stains that could have been rust or water damage, but looked disturbingly like dried blood. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, scattered papers, and what looked like pieces of clothing that had been torn and discarded. But most disturbing of all were the restraints. Chains hung from hooks driven into the log walls. Rope was coiled in corners like sleeping snakes. And in the center of the room, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the broken windows, was what looked like a wooden chair with leather straps attached to the arms and legs. "God," I breathed, the word escaping my lips before I could stop it. Brett heard me and turned around, his expression a mixture of excitement and satisfaction. "Pretty impressive, isn't it? This place has quite a history." "We need to leave," I said, backing away from the cabin. "Right now. We need to get out of here." "Leave?" Brett asked, tilting his head with mock confusion. "But we just got here, Connor. Don't you want to see the inside? It's really quite fascinating from a historical perspective." He started walking toward me, the knife still in his hand, and I realized with growing horror that he had no intention of letting me leave. Whatever he had planned for this isolated cabin, whatever had happened to those other missing children he had mentioned, I was about to become part of that story. "My parents know where I am," I lied desperately. "They saw me leave with you. If I don't come back soon, they'll come looking for me." Brett laughed. and the sound was like ice water in my veins. Oh, Connor, we both know that's not true. Your parents are completely absorbed in that baseball game. They probably haven't even noticed you're gone yet. He was right, and we both knew it. I could be missing for another hour or more before my parents would start to worry, and even then, they would have no idea where to look for me. The path to this cabin was barely visible. The location was known only to Brett and whoever else had used this place for their horrible purposes. I was completely and utterly alone. Besides, Brett continued, moving closer with each word, even if they did come looking, they'd never find this place. I've been bringing kids up here for years, and nobody has ever found us. The casual way he said it, bringing kids up here for years, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a crime of opportunity. This was something he had done before, multiple times, with other children who had trusted him just like I had. Children who had probably never been seen again. Please, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to Brett or to God, or to the universe in general. Please don't do this. Brett stopped walking and studied my face with what looked like genuine curiosity. Don't do what, Connor? I haven't done anything yet. I've just brought you to see something interesting, just like I promised. But the knife in his hand and the horror show inside the cabin told a very different story. Whatever he was planning to do to me, whatever had happened to those other children, was about to begin, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. That's when I heard the sound that would save my life. The distant rumble of a truck engine, growing closer through the woods, accompanied by men's voices shouting my name. Connor! Connor, where are you? Brett's head snapped toward the sound, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to something that looked like panic. The knife disappeared back into his pocket so quickly that I almost missed the movement. Shit, he muttered under his breath. And for the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely worried. The voices were getting closer, and I could make out at least 2 different men calling my name. One of them sounded like my father, but I couldn't be sure over the distance and the interference of the trees. Connor, answer us if you can hear us. Brett looked at me with an expression that was equal parts fury and calculation. For a moment, I thought he might try to grab me, to drag me into that nightmare cabin and hope that the searchers would miss us in the dense woods. But then the sound of the truck engine grew much louder, and we could both hear the crack and rustle of someone forcing their way through the underbrush, moving fast and with purpose. Another time, Brett said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that made my skin crawl. This isn't over, Connor. And then he was gone, disappearing into the woods on the far side of the clearing with a speed and silence that suggested he had planned his escape route long before he had brought me to this place. I stood frozen in the clearing for what felt like an eternity, staring at the open door of that horrible cabin, unable to move or speak or even breathe properly. The reality of what had almost happened, what would have happened if those voices hadn't appeared when they did, was too enormous for my child's mind to fully process. Connor. The voice was definitely my father's now, close enough that I could hear the desperation and fear in it. I tried to call back to him, to let him know where I was, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me entirely. And then he was there, bursting into the clearing with the wild-eyed look of a parent who had been imagining the absolute worst. Behind him was Mr. Patterson, a grizzled Vietnam veteran who lived down the road from us and had apparently joined the search. My father's eyes took in the scene, me standing alone in front of the horrifying cabin, no sign of anyone else. The clear evidence that something terrible had been interrupted, and his face went through a series of expressions that I would remember for the rest of my life. Relief at finding me safe, horror at what might have happened, and a cold, murderous rage directed at whoever had brought his child to this place. Connor, he said, his voice shaking with emotion as he reached me and pulled me into his arms. Thank God. Thank God you're okay. But as he held me, and as Mr. Patterson grimly examined the interior of the cabin with the professional eye of someone who had seen the worst that human beings were capable of, I knew that I wasn't really okay. I might be physically unharmed, but something inside me had been permanently changed by this experience. The innocence that had allowed me to trust a stranger's friendly smile was gone forever, replaced by a wariness that would color every interaction I had for the rest of my life. And somewhere out there, Brett was still free, still looking for his next victim, still planning to finish what he had started with me. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The ride home from Millfield took place in almost complete silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio that my father had insisted on monitoring after we reported the incident to the local authorities. I sat wedged between my parents in the front seat of the pickup truck, my mother's arm wrapped around me so tightly that it was almost difficult to breathe, but I didn't complain. The physical contact felt like the only thing anchoring me to reality. Every few minutes, my father would glance over at me with an expression that mixed relief with barely contained rage. I could see him struggling with questions he wanted to ask, but wasn't sure I was ready to answer. My mother, meanwhile, seemed to be operating under the assumption that if she held me close enough, she could somehow undo whatever psychological damage had been done in those woods. The police had taken the incident seriously, which was both reassuring and terrifying. Detective Morrison, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that was probably developed specifically for dealing with traumatized children, had spent nearly an hour asking me questions about Brett's appearance, his manner of speaking, and any details I could remember about our conversation. But when it came to describing what I had seen inside that cabin, I found myself struggling to find words. How do you explain to adults that you've looked into the face of pure evil? How do you convey the bone-deep certainty that terrible things had happened in that place, and that you had come within minutes, maybe seconds, of becoming part of that history? The boy mentioned that this person claimed to have brought other children to this location. Detective Morrison had said to my father, speaking quietly, but not so quietly that I couldn't hear every word. We're going to need to process that cabin as a potential crime scene. It's going to take some time. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. If Brett had been telling the truth about bringing other children to the cabin, if those restraints and stains inside the building were what they appeared to be, then this was much bigger than just my near miss with a potential predator. How many other children? My mother had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Morrison had looked uncomfortable. We don't know yet, ma'am. We'll need to compare this location with our files on missing persons cases, check with other jurisdictions in the area. It's going to be a lengthy investigation. Now, as we drove through the gathering dusk toward home, I found myself thinking about those other children Brett had mentioned. The ones who had disappeared from the playground over the years. The ones who had been found changed and traumatized. The ones who had never been found at all. Had they all started their ordeal the same way I had? With a friendly stranger who told scary stories and offered to show them something special? Had they all ignored their instincts and followed someone they should have run from? Connor, my father said suddenly, breaking the long silence. I need you to understand something. What happened today? It wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. If I had listened to my instincts, if I had run when every cell in my body was telling me to run, none of this would have happened. The police wouldn't be processing a crime scene. My parents wouldn't be traumatized. And maybe, if I had reported Brett earlier, some other child wouldn't become his next victim. Your father's right, my mother added, her voice thick with emotion. That man was a predator, Connor. Predators are experts at manipulating children, at making them feel special and mature and chosen. It's not your fault that you trusted him. But even as she said it, I could hear the unspoken questions in her voice. How had they not noticed that I was gone? How had they been so absorbed in a baseball game that they missed their child disappearing with a stranger? What kind of parents were they if they couldn't even keep their 10-year-old safe at a public park? The guilt wasn't just mine to bear. My parents were carrying their own heavy load of what-ifs and if-onlys, and I could see it weighing them down with every mile we traveled. When we finally pulled into our driveway, the familiar sight of our small farmhouse should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt exposed and vulnerable. The woods that bordered our property, which had always seemed friendly and inviting, now looked dark and threatening. Every shadow could be hiding someone watching our house, waiting for another opportunity. "I think we should call your brother," my mother said to my father as we climbed the front porch steps. "Timothy's going to want to know what happened." Timothy. In all the chaos and fear of the afternoon, I had completely forgotten about my older brother. The baseball game that had started this whole nightmare seemed like it had happened days ago rather than just a few hours. Timothy's team had probably won or lost by now, and he was probably wondering why his family had disappeared before the game was over. "He's staying overnight at the coach's house tonight," my father reminded her. "Team bonding or some such. We'll call him in the morning." I was grateful for the reprieve. The thought of having to explain to Timothy what had happened, of seeing the look in his eyes when he realized how close he had come to losing his little brother, was more than I could handle at the moment. Inside the house, my mother immediately began what could only be described as nervous, busy work. She started cooking a dinner none of us would have any appetite for, cleaning kitchen counters that were already spotless, rearranging items that didn't need rearranging. It was her way of processing trauma, staying in motion, keeping her hands busy, maintaining the illusion that normal domestic activities could somehow restore normalcy to our lives. My father, meanwhile, had taken on the role of security chief. He walked through the house checking every door and window lock, testing the batteries in our smoke detectors, and generally inspecting our home's defenses as if he expected an imminent attack. Which, given what had happened, didn't seem entirely unreasonable. As for me, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the tree line beyond our backyard, wondering if Brett was out there somewhere watching our house. Detective Morrison had assured us that every law enforcement agency in a 50-mile radius had been given Brett's description and would be looking for him, but that didn't make me feel any safer. Predators like Brett didn't just give up and move on when one of their plans was interrupted. They adapted. They learned. They found new ways to get what they wanted. "Connor," my father said, pulling up a chair beside me at the table. "I know today was scary, and I know you're probably going to have a lot of questions and feelings about what happened, but I want you to know that you can talk to us about anything. Anything at all." I nodded, though I wasn't sure that was true. How could I explain to my parents that I felt fundamentally changed by what had happened? That the world looked different now, darker and more dangerous than it had just that morning? That I was afraid I would never feel truly safe again? "The detective mentioned that they might want to talk to you again in a few days," my mother said, joining us at the table with 3 cups of hot chocolate that none of us had asked for. "After they've had a chance to process the crime scene and see what they find." Crime scene. The word sent a fresh chill through me. That cabin wasn't just an abandoned building where a disturbed teenager told scary stories. It was a place where real crimes had been committed, where real children had suffered, where I had almost become another victim in a pattern of abuse that might have been going on for years. "What if they don't catch him?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in my chest since we left the woods. My parents exchanged a look that told me they had been wondering the same thing. "They'll catch him," my father said with more confidence than I think he actually felt. "Mr. Patterson got a good look at him when he was running away. The police have a detailed description, and now they know about the cabin, which means they can watch for him there." But I knew, with the terrible certainty that comes from having looked evil in the face, that Brett was too smart to go back to that cabin. He would find another location, develop another method, target other children who didn't have the benefit of knowing what he was capable of. "He said he'd been bringing kids there for years," I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. The silence that followed my statement was deafening. My parents sat frozen, as if saying anything might somehow make that horrible possibility more real than it already was. Finally, my mother reached across the table and took my hand in both of hers. "Connor, honey, you don't need to think about that. You don't need to carry that burden. That's for the police to worry about." But I was thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Somewhere out there were parents who had never found their children, families destroyed by a predator who had perfected his methods over years of practice. And I was one of the lucky ones. I had gotten away. The thought made me feel guilty in a way I couldn't fully understand. Why had I been saved when others hadn't? What made me special enough to deserve rescue when other children had presumably faced their fate alone in that horrible cabin? "I think," my father said slowly, "that we should consider talking to someone. A counselor, maybe. Someone who specializes in helping children process traumatic experiences." The suggestion should have felt like defeat, like an admission that I was too weak to handle what had happened on my own. Instead, it felt like relief. The idea that there were people who understood trauma, who could help me make sense of the feelings I was struggling with, was more comforting than I had expected. "I think that's a good idea," I said quietly. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that should have been beautiful but instead looked ominous. Night was coming, and with it, all the fears and uncertainties that darkness brings to a child who has just learned that the world is full of people who want to hurt him. But inside our house, surrounded by my family with locks on the doors and Detective Morrison's business card on the refrigerator, I felt something that might have been the beginning of safety. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough to erase what had happened or to guarantee that nothing like it would ever happen again. But it was a start. 3 days later, Detective Morrison called our house with news that turned my blood to ice. The crime scene investigators had finished their preliminary examination of the cabin, and what they had found was worse than anyone had imagined. I listened from the top of the stairs as my parents took the call in the kitchen, their voices growing more strained and horrified with each piece of information the detective shared. Even from that distance, even hearing only one side of the conversation, the details that filtered up to me painted a picture of systematic horror that would haunt my dreams for years to come. "How many?" my mother asked at one point, her voice breaking on the words. The silence that followed was answer enough. When my father finally spoke again, his voice was hollow and shaken in a way I had never heard before. "Dear God," he whispered. "How long has this been going on?" The investigators had found evidence linking the cabin to at least 7 missing children cases spanning a period of nearly 5 years. DNA evidence, personal belongings, and other forensic materials that painted a picture of predation on a scale that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what they had found in a hidden compartment beneath the cabin's floorboards, a collection of photographs and journals that documented Brett's crimes in meticulous detail. The photographs, Detective Morrison explained, were too graphic and disturbing to be described, but the journals revealed a mind that was not only deeply disturbed but also methodical and organized in its approach to victimizing children. The journals indicate that he's been operating in this area for several years, Detective Morrison told my parents. He appears to have a pattern of targeting children at public events, baseball games, county fairs, school functions, places where families gather and parents might be distracted. The pattern was sickeningly familiar. Friendly older teenager approaches group of children, tells scary stories to capture their attention, isolates one child from the group, lures them away with promises of adventure or special attention. And then, the cabin. "We believe Connor was extremely fortunate," the detective continued. "Based on what we found at the scene, this individual's interactions with previous victims were extensive. The fact that Connor was rescued before any physical harm occurred is nothing short of miraculous. My mother's soft sobbing drifted up the stairs, punctuated by my father's attempts to comfort her. I knew they were both thinking the same thing I was. How close I had come to becoming just another entry in Brett's journal, another photograph in his collection, another family destroyed by his sickness. "What about the suspect?" my father asked. "Any leads on his whereabouts?" The answer was frustratingly vague. Despite an intensive manhunt involving multiple law enforcement agencies, Brett had seemingly vanished without a trace. His description had been circulated to every police department, sheriff's office, and federal agency in the region, but so far there had been no confirmed sightings. "We believe he's still in the area," Detective Morrison said. "Predators like this rarely abandon a territory they've been successfully operating in for years. He's more likely to lay low for a while and then resume his activities when he thinks the heat has died down." The thought that Brett was still out there, still hunting, still looking for opportunities to hurt children, made me feel sick to my stomach. Every time I left the house, every time I saw a teenager with curly brown hair, every time I heard a voice that sounded even remotely similar to his, my heart would race and my hands would start to shake. "We're going to need Connor to work with a police sketch artist," the detective continued. "We have Mr. Patterson's description from when he saw the suspect fleeing, but Connor spent the most time with him. His input could be crucial to creating an accurate composite." The idea of having to relive that afternoon in enough detail to help create a picture of Brett's face was terrifying, but I knew it was necessary. If there was any chance that my memories could help catch him before he hurt another child, I had to try. The sketch session was scheduled for the following morning at the police station, and I spent that night lying awake, trying to prepare myself mentally for what would be required. I would have to remember every detail of Brett's appearance, every nuance of his expressions, every characteristic that might help someone recognize him. But more than that, I would have to remember the sound of his voice, the way his demeanor had changed as we walked deeper into the woods, the moment when his mask had finally slipped completely and I had seen him for what he really was. The next morning, my parents drove me to the police station in a silence that felt heavy with unspoken fears. The building was smaller than I had expected, just a single-story brick structure that looked more like a school administrative office than the headquarters of a major criminal investigation. Detective Morrison met us in the lobby and led us to a small conference room where a woman named Sandra Walsh was waiting with a large sketch pad and an array of pencils. She was probably in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of calm, professional demeanor that suggested she had spent years helping traumatized witnesses reconstruct the faces of people who had hurt them. "Connor," she said with a gentle smile, "I know this might be difficult, but I want you to know that you're helping us do something very important. The picture we create together could help protect other children." The process was more intensive than I had anticipated. Sandra started with basic facial structure, the shape of Brett's head, the set of his jaw, the general proportions of his features. Then we moved on to specific details, the exact shape of his eyes, the curve of his nose, the texture and pattern of his curly hair. Each element required multiple attempts and revisions. Sandra would sketch something based on my description, show it to me, and then make adjustments based on my feedback. A little rounder. The eyes were closer together. The hair was curlier in the front. As the face began to take shape on the paper, I felt a growing sense of unease. Seeing Brett's features emerge under Sandra's skilled pencil made him real again in a way that was almost unbearable. It was like summoning a demon, calling him back into existence through the act of remembering. "How are we doing?" Sandra asked after about an hour of work. "Does this look like the person you remember?" I stared at the sketch, and my breath caught in my throat. It was him. Not perfect. No sketch could capture the subtle expressions and mannerisms that had made Brett so unnervingly convincing, but unmistakably the face of the person who had tried to lure me to that cabin. "That's him," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Detective Morrison leaned in to examine the sketch, his expression grim. This is excellent work, Connor. Really excellent. We'll get this out to every law enforcement agency in the state within the next few hours. But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Brett had managed to operate undetected for years, victimizing multiple children without being caught. A sketch, no matter how accurate, was just one tool in an investigation that was proving frustratingly difficult. "Detective," my father said, "what are the chances that you'll actually catch this guy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Detective Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how honest to be in front of a 10-year-old who had already been traumatized enough. "We're doing everything we can," he finally said. "But I have to be honest with you. Predators like this are often very skilled at avoiding detection. They're intelligent, they plan carefully, and they're motivated by drives that most of us can't understand." He paused, looking directly at me. "But Connor, I want you to know that what you did today, helping us create this sketch, could make all the difference. Sometimes it's the smallest details that break a case wide open." As we left the police station, sketch completed, and my part in the official investigation finished, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that I had done everything I could to help. Fear that it wouldn't be enough. And a growing certainty that this was far from over. Brett was still out there, still hunting, still perfecting his methods. And somewhere, probably not too far away, there was another child who would soon face the same choice I had faced. Trust a friendly stranger's invitation, or listen to the voice inside that whispers danger. I could only hope that when that moment came, that child would be luckier than I had been. Or that the sketch we had created would help ensure that Brett never got the chance to approach another victim. But deep down, in the part of my mind that had been forever changed by that afternoon in the woods, I knew that evil like Brett's doesn't simply disappear because a sketch has been drawn or an investigation has been launched. It adapts. It waits. It finds new ways to accomplish its goals. And it never, ever gives up. 6 months later, I still checked the locks on my bedroom windows every night before going to sleep. The counseling sessions with Dr. Patricia Henley had helped tremendously. She specialized in childhood trauma and had given me tools for managing the anxiety and hypervigilance that had become constant companions since that day at the baseball field. But no amount of therapy could completely erase the knowledge that Brett was still out there, somewhere, still hunting. The investigation had gone cold by October. Despite the sketch, despite the evidence found at the cabin, despite the coordinated efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies, Brett had simply vanished. Detective Morrison called our house once a month with updates that were really just confirmations that there were no updates. No sightings, no new leads, no breaks in the case. "These things can take time," he would tell my parents during these calls. "Sometimes years, but we haven't given up, and we're not going to give up." But I could hear the frustration in his voice, the professional disappointment of an experienced investigator who knew that with each passing day, the chances of catching Brett grew smaller. Cold cases had a way of staying cold, especially when the perpetrator was intelligent enough to change his patterns and disciplined enough to lay low. The worst part was the not knowing. Was he still in the area, watching and waiting for the investigation to lose steam? Had he moved on to some other region where he could start fresh with new victims? Or was he simply biding his time, confident that he could eventually resume his activities in familiar territory? I had started having dreams about him. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid scenarios where I would spot him in crowded places and try to alert authorities, only to watch him disappear into crowds of people who couldn't or wouldn't see what I was seeing. In these dreams, I was always the only one who recognized him, the only one who understood the danger he represented. Dr. Henley said these dreams were a manifestation of what she called survivor's responsibility. The feeling that because I had escaped, I was somehow obligated to protect other potential victims. She assured me that these feelings were normal and would fade with time, but I wasn't so sure. The truth was, I did feel responsible. Every time I saw a news story about a missing child, every time I heard about suspicious activity at a school or park, I wondered if Brett was involved. I wondered if there was something more I could have done, some detail I'd forgotten that might have helped the investigation. My family had adapted to our new reality in different ways. My mother had become fiercely protective, insisting on knowing exactly where I was at all times and requiring check-ins that probably seemed excessive to my friends' parents. My father had channeled his anger into advocacy, volunteering with organizations that worked to prevent child abduction and educate families about predatory behavior. Timothy, who had been devastated when he learned what had happened, had appointed himself my unofficial bodyguard. He walked me to and from school, vetted my friends with the intensity of a Secret Service agent, and made it clear to everyone in our small town that anyone who wanted to mess with his little brother would have to go through him first. But perhaps the biggest change was in me. The boy who had trustingly followed a stranger into the woods was gone, replaced by someone who questioned motives, analyzed interactions, and maintained a constant state of wariness that was exhausting but necessary. I had learned to read people differently, to notice the subtle signs that Dr. Henley had taught me to recognize. The way someone paid too much attention to children. The person who seemed just a little too interested in learning details about family routines. The adult who tried to create situations where they would be alone with kids. It was a skill set I never wanted to have, but one that might save my life, or someone else's, someday. The one-year anniversary of the incident came and went without fanfare. I had hoped that reaching that milestone might bring some sense of closure, but instead it just reminded me how long Brett had been free to continue his activities elsewhere. Detective Morrison called that day with what he probably thought was encouraging news. The case had been featured on a national television program about unsolved crimes, and they had received several tips from viewers who thought they might have seen Brett in various locations across the country. Most of these tips don't pan out, he admitted, but it only takes one. We're following up on every single lead. But I could hear in his voice that even he was starting to lose hope. A year was a long time in law enforcement terms. Budgets were tight, resources were limited, and there were always new cases demanding attention. The investigation into Brett would continue, but it would no longer be a priority. As I entered my sophomore year of high school, I had largely learned to live with the uncertainty. The daily fear had subsided into something more manageable, a background awareness that never quite went away but no longer dominated my every waking moment. I had even started dating, though I found it difficult to trust new people and tended to stick with friends I had known since childhood. Sarah Martinez, whose family had moved to town the year after the incident, had been patient with my quirks and protective instincts, though I had never told her the full story of why I was the way I was. It was during our junior year that I got the call that changed everything. I was studying for a chemistry test when my father answered the phone in the kitchen. I heard him say Detective Morrison, and immediately stopped what I was doing to listen. "When?" my father asked, his voice sharp with sudden attention. The conversation continued for several minutes, but I could only hear my father's side of it. "Are you sure it's him? Where? What happens now?" When he finally hung up the phone, I was already standing in the kitchen doorway, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. "They caught him," my father said quietly. "They caught Brett." The details came out slowly over the next few days. Brett had been arrested in a small town in Ohio, caught in the act of trying to lure a 12-year-old boy away from a youth soccer tournament. But this time, the child had been smart enough to immediately run to his parents, and alert security guards had spotted Brett fleeing the scene. When police apprehended him 3 blocks away, they found items in his car that linked him not only to the Indiana cabin, but to similar crimes in 4 other states. DNA evidence, personal belongings from victims, and most damning of all, an updated journal that documented his activities during the 3 years he had been on the run. "He never stopped," Detective Morrison told my family during a conference call. "Based on what we're finding, he continued his pattern in multiple locations. We believe there are at least 6 additional victims across Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. The news should have felt like victory, like vindication, like the closure I had been seeking for years. Instead, it felt like a punch to the gut. While I had been going to therapy and learning to manage my trauma, Brett had been destroying other families, traumatizing other children, adding new entries to his collection of horror. 6 more victims. 6 more families torn apart because a monster had been allowed to roam free. "Connor," Detective Morrison said, his voice gentle but serious. "We're going to need you to testify at his trial. Your case was the first one where we have a living witness who can describe his methods, his approach, the psychological manipulation he uses. Your testimony could be crucial to ensuring he never has the opportunity to hurt another child." The prospect of facing Brett in a courtroom, of having to relive that day in front of a jury and a judge and the man who had tried to destroy my childhood, was terrifying. But it was also necessary. "I'll do it," I said without hesitation. "Whatever you need me to do." The trial took place 8 months later in a federal courthouse in Cincinnati. Brett had been charged under federal statutes related to the transportation of minors across state lines for criminal purposes, which meant the death penalty was on the table. Seeing him again after all those years was surreal. He looked older, thinner, his curly brown hair now showing streaks of gray. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, utterly without remorse or empathy. When he looked at me during my testimony, I saw no recognition, no acknowledgement of the trauma he had caused. To him, I was just another witness, another obstacle to overcome, another problem to be managed. My testimony lasted for 2 full days. I described in excruciating detail the events of that afternoon, the psychological manipulation Brett had used, the horror I had seen inside that cabin. I spoke about the years of therapy, the nightmares, the way the experience had fundamentally changed how I viewed the world and other people. The defense attorney tried to discredit my memory, suggesting that the trauma had distorted my recollection of events, that I was an unreliable witness whose testimony had been contaminated by years of therapy and media exposure. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and the similarities between my experience and the accounts of other victims created a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. On the final day of the trial, Brett's attorney offered to have him plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The prosecution accepted, sparing the victims' families the trauma of a lengthy sentencing phase and ensuring that Brett would never again have the opportunity to hurt a child. As the judge read the sentence, multiple life terms to be served consecutively with no possibility of parole, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting or the peace of moving on, but the peace that comes from knowing that justice has been served and that a monster can no longer hurt innocent people. Brett was led away in shackles, his head down, his confident demeanor finally broken. As he passed the section where victim families were seated, he glanced up once and our eyes met for a brief moment. In that instant, I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. For the first time since I had known him, Brett looked like what he really was. A broken, pathetic human being who would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, forgotten by the world, except as a cautionary tale. "It's over," my father said as we left the courthouse, his arm around my shoulders. And for the first time in 7 years, I believed him. The nightmares didn't stop immediately. The hypervigilance took months to fade. The trust issues would probably never completely disappear. But the knowledge that Brett was locked away forever, that he would never again have the opportunity to destroy a family or steal a child's innocence, was enough to begin the real healing process. I graduated from high school the following spring, went on to college, and eventually became a social worker specializing in child protection services. The boy who had once trustingly followed a stranger into the woods had grown into a man whose life's work was protecting other children from predators like Brett. Detective Morrison retired a few years after the trial, but we still exchange Christmas cards. In his last note, he told me that the investigation into Brett's crimes had led to the closure of 17 cold cases across 6 states, bringing closure to families who had been wondering about their missing children for years. None of those families would have gotten answers if you hadn't been brave enough to testify, he wrote. You saved a lot of people from a lifetime of not knowing. I keep that card in my office, along with the original police sketch that Sandra Walsh had created from my memories. They serve as reminders of how close I came to being another statistic, another missing child poster, another family destroyed by evil. But they also remind me that evil, no matter how clever or patient or determined, can be defeated by ordinary people who refuse to give up, who insist on justice, and who are willing to stand up and say, "This happened to me, and it was wrong, and it must never happen again." Brett died in prison in 2018, stabbed by another inmate who had learned about his crimes. I felt no satisfaction when I heard the news, just a quiet sense that the world had become a slightly safer place. The boy I was that summer day in 1987 is gone forever, replaced by scars and wisdom that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But that boy's courage in the face of unimaginable evil, his willingness to trust his instincts when it mattered most, and his determination to help bring a monster to justice, those things live on. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. The evil that stalks children in playgrounds and parks and public places hasn't disappeared with Brett's death. There are others out there, using the same methods, targeting the same vulnerabilities, counting on the same assumptions that led me into those woods all those years ago. But there are also more people watching now, more families educated about the warning signs, more children taught to trust their instincts and run when something feels wrong. The fight against evil is never really over. But sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you get to win a battle that matters. And sometimes that's enough to make all the nightmares worthwhile. My name is Malcolm Riker, and this happened to me back in 2009. I was a Navy SEAL at the time, stationed in a remote part of Alaska on a covert mission. It wasn't anything too flashy, mostly reconnaissance and intel gathering, but the remoteness and the harsh conditions made it tough. We were in an area called the Kenai Peninsula, a lesser-known stretch of wilderness that most people have never heard of. The cold in Alaska isn't like cold anywhere else. It's alive somehow, predatory. It searches for any exposed skin and bites without mercy. Even through military-grade thermal gear, it finds ways to seep in, to remind you that humans don't belong in places like this. Our outpost was little more than a reinforced cabin, hidden deep in the forest where satellite imagery wouldn't easily detect it. Official records would show we were never there. It was just me and my buddy, Roy Draven. Roy was a good guy, solid as a rock and always ready with a joke to lighten the mood. We'd been through 2 tours in Afghanistan together, so we had a kind of unspoken bond that comes from facing danger side by side. He was shorter than me, but built like a bull, with a red beard he'd been growing out since we arrived in Alaska 3 weeks earlier. "This beard is the only thing keeping my face from freezing off," he'd joke, stroking it like it was a pet. "Plus, the ladies back home are gonna love the rugged mountain man look." Our mission parameters were simple: monitor a suspected Russian listening post on the peninsula and gather intel on their activities. Nothing we couldn't handle, though the isolation was starting to wear on us both. Our only contact with the outside world was a scheduled radio check-in every 48 hours. On that night, February 17th, if I remember correctly, we were out on a routine patrol, trekking through the dense forest. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around -20, and our breaths were brief visible ghosts in the frigid air. The trees loomed overhead, ancient sentinels watching our intrusion into their domain. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the snow and the occasional rustle of wildlife. We were armed, of course. Standard issue M4 carbines and sidearms. You never know what you might run into out there, be it Russian operatives or a hungry grizzly that hadn't gotten the memo about hibernation. "Man, what I wouldn't give for a hot shower and a beer right now," Roy muttered, as we navigated a particularly steep section of terrain. His voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest. "Keep dreaming," I replied. "Only 5 more weeks of this paradise." Roy chuckled, his breath forming a cloud around his face. "Hey, at least the view is—" That's when we heard it, a distant scream echoing through the trees. It sounded human but distorted, like it was coming from someone in terrible pain. The sound cut through the night and seemed to hang in the air, reverberating among the trees. Roy and I exchanged glances, our training kicking in immediately. Without a word, we adjusted our night vision goggles and headed in the direction of the sound. We moved quickly but cautiously, weapons ready, every sense on high alert. As we got closer, the screams became more frantic, mixed with a strange, almost guttural noise. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and it set my nerves on edge. It wasn't just pain. There was terror in that sound, raw and primal. "You think it's an animal attack?" Roy whispered as we paused behind a large pine tree. I shook my head. "Doesn't sound like it. Too deliberate." We continued forward, moving as silently as our training allowed. The screams had diminished to moans now, punctuated by what sounded like sobbing. The forest seemed to have gone completely silent around us, as if every creature was holding its breath. We broke through into a small clearing, and that's when we saw it. A figure huddled on the ground, writhing in agony. "Jesus, what the hell is that?" Roy muttered, his rifle trained on the shape. We approached slowly, weapons raised. The moonlight reflected off the snow, casting everything in an eerie blue glow. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" The figure didn't respond, just kept moaning and twisting. I moved closer, and that's when I saw the blood, dark stains spreading across the pristine snow. The figure was a man, middle-aged from what I could tell, with a gaunt face and wide, terrified eyes. His clothes were torn, and there were deep gashes on his arms and legs, as if he'd been mauled by something. "We need to get him out of here," Roy said, his voice tense. "He's not going to make it if we don't." I nodded, slinging my rifle over my shoulder. As I knelt beside the man, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging into my jacket. "It found me," he rasped, his eyes wild with fear. "It can find anyone. Watches from the trees." "Who found you?" I asked, trying to assess his injuries. "Was it an animal?" The man let out a choked laugh that turned into a cough, flecks of blood spraying from his lips. "Not animal, not man. Been here forever. Watching." Roy and I lifted him between us, and he let out a weak cry. His body felt oddly light, as if he'd been out here for days without food. "Hang on, buddy. We got you," I said, trying to sound reassuring. As we started back toward our camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of the trees and the endless snow. The man we were carrying kept muttering incoherently, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then I noticed it. The silence. The forest had gone completely quiet. No distant owl hoots, no rustle of nocturnal creatures. Nothing. Just our labored breathing and the soft sounds of our movement through the snow. "Roy," I whispered. "You hear that?" He nodded grimly. "I don't hear anything. That's the problem." Something was out there in the darkness. Something that had reduced this man to a trembling wreck. And I couldn't escape the feeling that its eyes were fixed on us, watching our every move. Halfway back to camp, the injured man started thrashing wildly in our grip. His sudden movement nearly caused us to drop him in the snow. "No, it's coming, it's coming!" he screamed, his eyes wild with fear. His body convulsed with such force that I could feel his muscles tearing beneath my grip. "Calm down. We're here to help you," Roy shouted, struggling to keep hold of him. That's when I saw it. something moving between the trees. It was fast, a blur of motion in the darkness beyond the reach of our night vision. My heart skipped a beat and I tightened my grip on the man. Roy, we need to move. Now. We broke into a run, the man's screams echoing in my ears. The terrain was treacherous, frozen ground hidden beneath deceptive layers of snow, fallen logs, and jagged rocks. Each step could mean a twisted ankle or worse, but the alternative was staying put, and my instincts were screaming against that option. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. I could hear it now, a strange clicking noise like nails on a chalkboard. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the forest itself was trying to communicate in some ancient, forgotten language. It won't stop until it gets what it wants, the man mumbled between ragged breaths. It never stops. I glanced back and caught a glimpse of it, tall and humanoid with long, spindly limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, like it wasn't bound by the same physical laws as everything else in the forest. "Go! Go!" I shouted, adrenaline surging through me. The clicking sound intensified, echoing through the trees. I could feel the creature gaining on us, not just physically, but somehow pressing against my mind, like a cold finger trailing down my spine. We burst into our camp, and I quickly dropped to one knee to radio for extraction. The man was barely conscious now, his eyes rolling back in his head, lips forming words with no sound. "This is Riker. We need immediate medical evacuation. We've got a severely injured civilian. I repeat, we need immediate evac." The radio crackled with static before the response came through. "Roger that, Riker. Chopper inbound. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes. We had to survive 15 minutes with that thing out there." Roy was panting heavily, his face pale beneath his beard. "What the hell was that thing?" he gasped. "I don't know," I replied, keeping my eyes on the tree line. "But it's not friendly." We moved the injured man into our shelter and did what we could to stabilize him. His wounds were unlike anything I'd seen before. Deep, precise cuts that seemed to follow a pattern across his body. They weren't random animal attacks. They looked almost ritualistic. "These aren't normal injuries," Roy muttered, applying pressure to a particularly nasty gash on the man's thigh. "Look at the edges. Clean, like they were made with a blade." The man's eyes suddenly snapped open, pupils dilated to pinpoints. "It marks you first," he whispered, "so it can find you again. It's been marking people for centuries." "Who are you?" I asked. "What were you doing out here?" "Dr. James Carrick, anthropologist, Anchorage University." Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "Studying local folklore. Found journals from 1898. Described the Watcher in the woods." His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "Burn the cabin. All of it. Only way." "What cabin?" Roy asked. "What are you talking about?" But Dr. Carrick's eyes had closed again, his breathing shallow and erratic. Outside, the clicking sound had stopped. The silence was somehow worse, heavy with anticipation, like the forest was holding its breath. "You think it's gone?" Roy whispered, his hand resting on his sidearm. I shook my head. "No, it's waiting." The minutes crawled by, each second stretching into eternity. We didn't have to wait long for the extraction. The distant thrum of helicopter blades broke through the silence, growing louder as it approached. "Get him ready to move," I said, gathering our essential gear. As we prepared to leave, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. The air inside our shelter grew so cold that my breath formed dense clouds. Roy noticed it too, his eyes widening as he looked toward the door. "Malcolm," he whispered. I turned slowly and saw a shadow pass across the entrance, taller than a man, with limbs too long and too thin. It paused there, just out of sight, as if considering whether to enter. The helicopter was close now, the sound of its rotors drowning out everything else. We lifted Carrick between us and moved toward the door. There was nothing there, nothing visible at least, but the air felt thick, resistant, as if we were pushing through invisible cobwebs. Outside, the helicopter was descending into the small clearing near our camp, its searchlight cutting through the darkness. We rushed toward it, the snow crunching beneath our boots. As we neared the helicopter, I looked back and saw the figure standing at the edge of our camp, watching us. It didn't move, just stood there, its glowing eyes following us as we ascended into the night sky. As we lifted off, Carrick suddenly seized up, his back arching impossibly. "It doesn't forget," he gasped, "and it never forgives." His body went limp in our arms. He was gone. Back at base, we were immediately separated and debriefed. The brass wasn't happy. Too many questions and not enough answers. A civilian dead on a classified operation was a complication they didn't need. "So, to be clear, Petty Officer Riker," the commander said, his face impassive, "you and Draven encountered a severely injured civilian in a restricted area, who then expired during extraction. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "But there was something else out there. Something that attacked him." "A bear, perhaps? Wolf? This is Alaska, after all." I hesitated. How could I describe what I'd seen? "No, sir, it was different." The commander exchanged glances with the intelligence officer sitting beside him. "Different how?" "Humanoid, sir, tall, and it moved wrong." They continued questioning me for hours, but I could see they'd already formed their own conclusions. Exposure, shock, the darkness playing tricks on us. Anything but accepting what I was describing. Finally, the commander closed his folder with a snap. "You and Draven are to remain on base until further notice. We're sending a recovery team to your position tomorrow to collect your gear. In the meantime, get some rest. You look like hell." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing orbs staring back at me from the darkness. And underneath my blanket, I discovered something that turned my blood to ice. 3 long, precise cuts on my forearm, exactly like the ones on Carrick's body. It had marked me. 3 days passed before Roy and I were allowed to return to the field. 3 days of medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and endless debriefings. The official report concluded that Dr. James Carrick had died from exposure and animal attacks, possibly after becoming disoriented in the wilderness. His presence in the area was attributed to unauthorized academic research. The cuts on my arm were dismissed as injuries sustained during the rescue. I didn't argue. What would be the point? But I knew the truth. And at night, when the base fell quiet, I could hear that clicking sound outside my window, like bony fingers tapping on glass. Roy believed me. He'd seen it too, though not as clearly as I had. "We stick together on this," he told me our final night at base. "They can write whatever they want in their reports, but we know what we saw." Our new orders were simple. Return to our outpost, continue the original mission, and report any unusual activity immediately. The subtext was clear. Don't cause any more problems. As our transport helicopter approached the drop zone, I felt a growing sense of dread. The wilderness stretched out below us, endless miles of snow-covered forest. Somewhere down there, it was waiting. "You okay?" Roy shouted over the roar of the rotors. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The cuts on my arm throbbed beneath my sleeve, as if responding to our proximity. We touched down 1/2 mile from our original camp. The pilot wouldn't go any closer, claiming concerns about terrain. As the helicopter lifted off, leaving us alone in the vastness, Roy turned to me. "Home, sweet home," he said with a forced grin. We made our way back to the outpost in silence, alert for any sign of movement among the trees. Everything looked the same, yet somehow fundamentally altered, as if the landscape itself had shifted slightly while we were gone. Our camp had been picked clean by the recovery team. All that remained was the basic shelter structure and some heavy equipment. We quickly set about making it operational again, working methodically to avoid thinking about what might be watching from the forest. That night, as we ate our rations in silence, Roy finally addressed the elephant in the room. "So what's the plan if that thing comes back?" I'd been asking myself the same question. Carrick mentioned a cabin, said we needed to burn it. You believe what a dying man was rambling about? I believe he knew what was hunting him, and now it's hunting me. I rolled up my sleeve, showing him the cuts. They'd taken on a strange, bluish tinge around the edges. Roy's eyes widened. Jesus, Malcolm, why didn't you tell me those were getting worse? Would it have changed anything? I shrugged. We still have our orders. Screw the orders. That thing marked you. I nodded slowly. Which is why we need to find that cabin. Carrick was an anthropologist studying local folklore. Whatever he found led him to that thing. Or it to him. Roy was quiet for a long moment, considering. "First light tomorrow," he finally said. "We'll start searching, but we stick together, understood? No heroics." I agreed, though I already knew it was too late for caution. The clicking had started again, distant but unmistakable, drifting through the trees like a macabre lullaby. Morning came after a restless night. The forest was shrouded in mist, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. We packed light, weapons, communications, basic survival gear, and set out. "Any idea where to look for this cabin?" Roy asked as we trudged through the fresh snow. "Carrick came from the north," I replied. "And he was running from something. So logically, the cabin should be that way." I pointed deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser and the mist seemed to cling more heavily. We walked for hours, the silence broken only by our breathing and the crunch of snow beneath our boots. The cuts on my arm pulsed with each step, growing more painful as we pushed farther north. "You feel that?" Roy asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. I paused beside him. "What?" "Like we're being herded." He was right. Our path had subtly shifted, guided by almost imperceptible obstacles. A fallen tree here, a dense thicket there, until we were heading northeast rather than due north. "It wants us to find the cabin," I said quietly. "It's leading us there." Roy's hand dropped to his sidearm. "Maybe we should turn back." "We can't. Don't you see? It's been one step ahead since we found Carrick. Our only chance is to find out what he knew." Reluctantly, Roy nodded, and we continued forward. The forest grew older around us, the trees massive and gnarled with age. Moss hung from the branches like funeral shrouds, and the ground became increasingly uneven, forcing us to watch every step. That's when we found them. Fresh tracks in the snow leading deeper into the forest. They were large, humanoid but with elongated toes ending in what looked like claws. The impressions were deep, suggesting considerable weight. Roy knelt down, examining them closely. "These aren't bear tracks," he said, his voice grim. I nodded. "Whatever made these, it's not natural." The tracks led us to a small ridge overlooking a narrow valley. And there it was, a small, abandoned cabin, half buried in the snow. From our vantage point, it looked ordinary enough, a simple structure with a steeply pitched roof, typical of the hunting cabins that dotted the Alaskan wilderness. But there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl just looking at it. "Think it's inside?" Roy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Only one way to find out," I replied, moving toward the path that led down to the cabin. As we approached, details became clearer. The cabin was old, probably built in the late 1800s or early 1900s. The logs had darkened with age, and the small windows were covered with wooden shutters. The door was ajar, creaking slightly in the gentle breeze. We paused at the edge of the small clearing surrounding the cabin. The snow here was pristine, untouched. No tracks leading to or from the entrance. "I don't like this," Roy muttered. "It's too quiet." He was right. The forest had fallen completely silent around us. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Nothing. "We need to know what's inside," I said, drawing my sidearm. "Cover me." I approached the cabin cautiously, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. The door swung open at my touch, revealing darkness beyond. The air that escaped from inside was stale and carried a faint, unpleasant odor, like old meat, and something else I couldn't identify. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Anyone here?" No response. I signaled to Roy, and he joined me at the entrance, his rifle at the ready. "After you," he said with a nervous smile. We entered the cabin slowly, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. And that's when we realized we'd made a terrible mistake. The interior of the cabin was a single room, perhaps 20 feet square. The ceiling was low, forcing Roy to duck his head slightly. Our flashlight beams revealed a scene of chaos and abandonment. Broken furniture, a collapsed bed frame, shattered windows long since boarded up from the inside. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, or perhaps never left at all. But it was the walls that drew our attention. Every available surface was covered with symbols, crude drawings, and text in a language I didn't recognize. They'd been carved directly into the wood, some shallow and hasty, others deep and deliberate, as if the carver had spent hours on each mark. "What the hell is all this?" Roy whispered, his flashlight tracing the patterns. I moved closer to examine the symbols. They depicted elongated, spindly figures surrounding human forms. In some, the humans were running. In others, they were prone on the ground with the tall figures looming over them. The sight made my arm throb painfully. "Look at these," I said, pointing to a section where the carvings were more recent, the wood still pale where it had been cut. "These aren't 100 years old." Roy nodded grimly. "Carrick's work?" "Must be." He said he was studying local folklore. In the center of the room stood a crude table, its surface covered with papers and what looked like a leather-bound journal. I approached cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the yellowed pages spread across the table. The journal was open to an entry dated 1898, February 3rd. Harrison returned tonight, half dead and raving mad. Claims the Tlingit legends are true. The Kushtaka took Stevens and Morris. Says they follow a pattern, marking their victims before taking them. Harrison bears 3 cuts on his arm. I fear he won't last the night. February 4th, Harrison dead by his own hand. Left a note warning us to burn the cabin and never return. The others want to leave immediately, but the storm makes travel impossible. I hear scratching at the walls tonight, like bone on wood. I flipped through more pages, finding similar accounts spanning decades. Different handwriting, different eras, but the same horrific encounters. The final entries were in a more modern hand, Carrick's presumably. January 30th, 2009. Found the cabin exactly where the university archives indicated. The symbols match those in the Tlingit pictographs perfectly. They believed the Kushtaka were shapeshifters, otter men who lured victims to their doom. But the journals tell a different story. Something older. Something that was here before humans arrived. February 10th. It's watching me. I can feel it. The marks on the trees follow the same pattern as those in the cabin. 3 parallel lines. Always 3. The clicking sound comes at night now, closer each time. February 15th. It marked me last night. 3 cuts on my arm, made while I slept. The old accounts say this is a death sentence. No one who bears the mark escapes. I'm leaving tomorrow at first light. Burn it all. It's the only way. "Roy," I said, my voice tight. "Carrick was right. We need to burn this place." Roy pointed to a corner of the room. Look at that. I turned my flashlight to where he was pointing and saw a pile of bones. Animal bones, by the look of them. But there were a few that were unmistakably human. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to vomit. "Let's get out of here," I said, gathering Carrick's journal and notes. "We'll torch it from outside." We turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with enough force to shake the entire cabin. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing across the room, but there was nothing there. Just the symbols and the bones and the heavy sense of something ancient and malevolent. The air grew colder, far colder than it should have been possible, even in an Alaskan winter. Our breath formed dense clouds around our faces, and frost began to crystallize on the walls, creeping across the symbols like living things. "Malcolm, what the hell is going on?" Roy's voice trembled, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear I felt coursing through me. "I don't know, but we need to find another way out." We moved to the windows, but they were all boarded up from the inside with heavy timbers. I could hear the clicking noise again, closer this time. It was coming from beneath us. "Basement," I muttered. "There's a basement." We found the trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden under a rug. It was old and creaked loudly as we pried it open. A set of rickety wooden stairs led down into the darkness. The clicking noise grew louder, echoing up from below. "I don't like this," Roy said, his voice shaky. "Me neither, but we don't have a choice." We descended the stairs, our flashlights barely penetrating the darkness. The basement was cold and damp, with a low ceiling that forced us to crouch. The clicking noise was deafening now, coming from just ahead. I moved forward, my flashlight sweeping the room. That's when I saw it. The creature crouched in the corner, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It was even more grotesque up close, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. It had long, clawed fingers and a mouth full of sharp, needle-like teeth. Its body was wrong. Too tall, too thin, joints bending in impossible directions. "Roy, get back!" I shouted, raising my rifle. But it was too late. The creature lunged at us with impossible speed. Roy fired his weapon, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the basement in stark, terrifying detail. The bullets hit the creature, but it barely flinched. It reached Roy in an instant, slashing at his throat with its claws. Blood sprayed across the room, and Roy fell to the ground, gasping for breath. His eyes found mine, wide with shock and terror, his mouth working soundlessly. "Roy!" I screamed, firing my rifle at the creature. The bullets hit it, but it barely seemed to notice. It turned its glowing eyes on me, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I kept firing, backing toward the stairs. The creature advanced, its movements almost fluid, like it wasn't bound by the same physical laws as everything else. Roy lay motionless on the ground, his blood pooling beneath him. I reached the stairs and scrambled up, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. I could hear the creature pounding on the door, but it held, for now. I pushed the heavy table over the trapdoor for good measure, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I radioed for backup, my voice barely recognizable even to myself. "This is Riker. We need immediate evac. Draven is down. Repeat, Draven is down." The response was immediate. "Roger that, Riker. Hold tight. We're on our way." I could still hear the creature below, but it seemed to have stopped trying to break through the door. Instead, I heard it clicking. That same bone-on-wood sound, but now it seemed almost like laughter. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. Roy was gone, and I felt a deep sense of loss. He'd been my friend, my brother in arms, and now he was dead. Gathering what remained of my courage, I began emptying my pack of emergency flares and the small amount of C4 we carried for clearing obstacles. I placed them strategically around the cabin, focusing on the support beams and the trapdoor. If I couldn't escape, I'd make damn sure this place burned with me and that thing inside it. As I worked, I noticed the symbols on the walls had changed, or rather, new ones had appeared alongside the old. Fresh carvings, still light in color against the darkened wood. They showed a spindly figure holding what looked like a human heart. The pounding from below had stopped. The silence was somehow worse, heavy with anticipation, like the creature was waiting for something. I checked my watch. The extraction team should be close now. I just had to hold out a little longer. I positioned myself near the door, weapon ready, and waited. Minutes passed like hours. The cuts on my arm burned like fire, and I could see they were changing, the edges turning black, the skin around them tightening and pulling away from the wound. They were no longer simple cuts. They were becoming something else. Something that made my stomach turn to look at. From below, the clicking started again. Slower this time, more deliberate. And then, impossibly, I heard Roy's voice. "Malcolm, help me. I'm hurt bad." I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. It wasn't possible. I'd seen Roy die, seen his throat torn open by those claws. "Please, it's so cold down here." The voice was perfect, every inflection, every nuance that made Roy who he was. But I knew it wasn't him. Couldn't be him. "Malcolm, just open the door, just for a second." I backed away from the trapdoor, my rifle trained on it. The table covering it began to shudder, moving slightly with each impact from below. "You're not Roy," I whispered. "He's gone." The voice changed then, becoming something inhuman, multiple tones layered together like a chorus of the damned. "We are all gone here, Malcolm Riker. All gone and all together." The table moved again, sliding a few inches across the floor. The trapdoor beneath it splintered at the edges. Outside, I heard the blessed sound of helicopter rotors approaching. The extraction team was here. I just had to get to the door. I lunged for it, yanking at the handle, but it remained firmly stuck. Not locked. Stuck, as if the wood itself had fused together. Behind me, the table slid further, and a long, pale hand with too many joints reached through the widening crack beneath the trapdoor. "No escape," the voices chanted. "No escape from what sees you." In desperation, I triggered the detonator for the C4. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, blowing out what remained of the windows and sending splinters of wood flying in all directions. Fire spread quickly, engulfing the dry timber walls. The trapdoor had been destroyed in the blast, and thick smoke poured from the opening. But there was no sign of the creature, just darkness below and the rapidly spreading flames above. I threw myself at the door again, and this time it gave way, sending me sprawling into the snow outside. The fresh air hit my lungs like a physical blow, and I gasped, coughing up black phlegm. The cabin was fully engulfed now, flames reaching high into the night sky. The extraction team was landing in the clearing, soldiers pouring out with weapons ready. As they rushed toward me, I looked back at the burning structure. Through the flames, I saw it. The creature, standing amidst the fire, untouched by the inferno around it. Its glowing eyes fixed on mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It raised one long, spindly arm and pointed directly at me. Then the roof collapsed, sending a shower of embers into the sky, and it was gone. The soldiers reached me, dragging me away from the burning cabin. "Petty Officer Riker? Where's Draven?" I couldn't speak. Couldn't form the words to explain what had happened. All I could do was stare at the flames, wondering if they would be enough to destroy what lived in that basement. As they loaded me onto the helicopter, I noticed the cuts on my arm had stopped burning. The blackness around the edges was receding, leaving only 3 thin, pale scars. Perhaps Carrick had been right. Perhaps fire was the answer. But as we lifted off, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the forest. A tall, thin figure watching the helicopter ascend. and I knew with sickening certainty that some things cannot be destroyed by fire alone. The military investigation that followed was exhaustive and ultimately inconclusive. Roy's body was never recovered from the cabin ruins, which fueled endless speculation. The official report cited a possible hostile encounter and accidental fire, conveniently vague terms that revealed nothing of the truth. I spent 2 weeks in the medical wing of Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, undergoing physical and psychological evaluations. The cuts on my arm had healed completely, leaving only 3 faint white lines, almost invisible unless you knew to look for them. Dr. Eliza Chen, the base psychologist, spent hours trying to get me to process what had happened. It's common for soldiers to experience hallucinations under extreme stress, she explained during one session. The isolation, the cold, the constant vigilance, it can make the mind create enemies where there are none. I didn't argue. What would be the point? I knew what I had seen. I knew what had taken Roy. They discharged me from the SEALs on medical grounds, PTSD, and stress-induced psychosis. I didn't fight that either. I was done with military life, done with taking orders from men who would never believe the truth. Instead, I turned my attention to the one thing I had salvaged from that night. Carrick's journal. I had stuffed it into my jacket before trying to escape the cabin, and somehow it had survived both the fire and the subsequent investigation. The military had cataloged it as personal effects and returned it to me upon discharge. The journal became my roadmap. Carrick had spent years tracking stories of the creature across Alaska and parts of Canada, different names in different cultures, but always the same description. Tall, thin, with glowing eyes and the ability to mimic voices. The Tlingit called it Kushtaka, the Russians called it Leshy, the Inuit had another name for it, but they all feared it equally. Carrick believed it wasn't supernatural, but something undiscovered, an ancient predator that had evolved alongside humans, learning to hunt us with terrifying efficiency. The marking was part of its hunting technique, a way of tracking specific prey over long distances. I spent the next 6 months traveling across Alaska, visiting remote villages and speaking with elders who still remembered the old stories. Many refused to talk about it at all, making signs to ward off evil when I mentioned the clicking sound or the 3 marks. Those who did speak confirmed what I already knew. The creature was patient, intelligent, and nearly impossible to escape once it had marked you. One elder, a Tlingit woman named Sarah Catlian, told me something that chilled me to the bone. "It doesn't just take the body," she said, her ancient face solemn in the lamplight. "It takes the soul, the voice, the memories. It becomes a little of each person it kills, and that makes it stronger." "How do you kill it?" I asked, the question that had driven me for months. She shook her head slowly. "My grandmother's grandmother tried. Many have tried. Fire works for a time, but it always comes back. Always. Then what can I do?" I was desperate now, the futility of my quest becoming clear. Sarah studied me for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to see through my skin to the scars beneath. "You bear its mark," she finally said. "It will find you eventually. Unless what? Unless you give it what it wants most. And what's that? A willing sacrifice." I left Sarah's home more confused than when I arrived. A willing sacrifice? What did that even mean? My search eventually led me back to the Kenai Peninsula, to the ruins of the cabin. The military had cordoned off the area initially, but it had been abandoned for months by the time I returned. Nature was already reclaiming the site, young saplings pushing through the charred earth. Nothing remained of the structure except the stone foundation and the basement, a dark hole in the ground filled with ash and debris. I approached it cautiously, weapon ready, though I doubted bullets would do much good if the creature returned. The basement was empty. No bones, no sign of Roy or the creature. Just cold stone walls and the lingering smell of smoke. I wasn't sure what I had expected to find. Closure, perhaps. some sign that it was truly over. As I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into one of the basement walls. 3 parallel lines, fresh against the soot-blackened stone. My arm throbbed in response, the scars suddenly warm beneath my sleeve. It was still here, still watching. I spent that night camped near the ruins, a fire burning bright to keep the darkness at bay. Sleep was impossible. Every sound from the forest set my nerves on edge. The clicking started around midnight. Distant at first, then gradually closer. "I know you're out there," I called into the darkness. "I know what you are." No response except the clicking, moving in a circle around my camp, always just beyond the reach of the firelight. "You took my friend," I continued. "You took Carrick. How many others?" The clicking stopped. Silence stretched out, heavy and expectant. Then from the darkness I heard Roy's voice again. Perfect in every detail. "Too many to count, Malcolm. And not enough. Never enough." I raised my weapon, scanning the tree line. "You're not him. Stop using his voice." "But I am him in a way." The voice changed, becoming Carrick's. "I am all of them. Their memories, their fears, their final moments. All preserved here." It tapped its chest with a sound like dry twigs snapping. "What do you want from me?" I demanded. The creature emerged from the shadows then, exactly as I remembered it. Tall and gaunt, with 2 long limbs and glowing eyes. It moved with that same unnatural fluidity, as if gravity was merely a suggestion rather than a law. "What I want from all of you," it said, its voice now a blending of many, men, women, children, all speaking in unison. "To be remembered, to be known." It circled my camp, keeping just beyond the firelight. "Your kind forgets so easily. You live your brief lives and die, taking your memories with you. But I remember. I have always remembered." "You're a predator," I said, keeping my weapon trained on it. "You hunt us." The creature made a sound like distant laughter. "I preserve you. Your friend is still here, still aware, as are all the others. They see through my eyes now." I thought of Sarah's words, a willing sacrifice. And what if someone offered themselves willingly? Would you release the others? The creature stopped moving, its glowing eyes fixing on me with terrifying intensity. "A trade? How? Human. Would you do it?" It seemed to consider, its head tilting at an impossible angle. "No one has ever offered before. They always run, always fight. I'm offering now." The creature moved closer, just at the edge of the firelight. "Why would you do this?" "For Roy, for all of them." It extended one long, spindly arm, the clawed fingers reaching toward me. "Come then, Malcolm Riker. Come and join us." I hesitated, my resolve wavering. Was I really going to sacrifice myself on the word of this thing? This ancient predator that had stalked humanity from the shadows for centuries? "How do I know you'll keep your word?" I asked. The creature's mouth stretched into something approximating a smile, revealing those needle-like teeth. "You don't. That's faith, isn't it? Another very human concept." I took a step forward, then another. The fire at my back. The creature before me. I could feel the cold emanating from it like standing at the edge of an open freezer. "One condition," I said, finding my voice. "I want to know what you are. Your true name." The creature's eyes flared brighter. "Names have power. You should know this, Malcolm Riker. Tell me anyway, before the end." It leaned closer, its face inches from mine. "We have no name in your tongue. We were here before words, before names, before your kind walked upright." And then it told me, not in words, but in images and sensations that flooded my mind. Visions of an ancient earth, of ice ages and primordial forests. Of a time when humans were few and frightened, huddling around fires in the darkness, and of the watchers in the trees, the patient hunters who learned to mimic, to lure, to preserve. I gasped, staggering backward as the visions receded. The creature remained motionless, watching me recover. "Now you know," it said. "Now you understand." I did understand, in a way that defied explanation. This thing wasn't evil, not in the human sense. It was simply other. A different kind of predator, one that took more than just flesh. "Let them go," I said. "Take me instead." The creature extended its hand again. I reached out, my fingers almost touching its pallid skin. A gunshot shattered the night. The creature jerked backward, a dark stain spreading across its chest. More shots followed in quick succession, and the forest erupted with shouts and the beams of flashlights. "Riker, get down!" someone yelled. I dropped to the ground as a team of armed men burst into the clearing, weapons trained on the creature. It retreated into the shadows with impossible speed, its clicking growing fainter as it disappeared into the forest. The men surrounded me, pulling me to my feet. They wore no identifying insignia, but their movements and equipment screamed military. Special operations, most likely. "Are you hurt?" one of them asked, scanning me with a critical eye. I shook my head, still dazed by what had almost happened. "Who are you? How did you find me?" "We've been tracking you since you left the base," the man replied. "You led us right to it." Another man approached, older than the others, with the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much. "Malcolm Riker, I'm Dr. James Larson. I believe you've been looking for answers about what happened to your friend." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "You know about the creature?" Larson nodded grimly. "We've been studying it for decades. Your encounter wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. They took me to a facility hidden in the mountains, a place that didn't exist on any map. There I learned the truth, or at least as much of it as they understood. The government had known about the creatures. There were more than one, since at least the 1940s. They had classified files dating back to the Alaskan Purchase, reports from Russian fur trappers who had encountered devils in the woods. "We call them observers," Larson explained as he showed me their research. "They've been studied by various agencies over the years. Military, scientific, even paranormal research groups. No one knows exactly what they are or where they came from, but they've been documented across the northern hemisphere." "Can they be killed?" I asked. Larson hesitated. "Not permanently, no, but they can be contained, studied. That's what we do here." He showed me cells deep underground, reinforced with materials I didn't recognize. Inside one, I saw a creature similar to the one I'd encountered, motionless. Its glowing eyes dimmed but still watchful. "We've tried everything," Larson said. "Conventional weapons, experimental ones, even nuclear radiation. They can be injured, temporarily incapacitated, but they always regenerate, and they never forget who hurt them." "What about the people they've taken? Their voices, their memories?" Larson's expression grew somber. "We don't know. There's evidence suggesting they absorbed something from their victims, some essence beyond the physical. But whether that constitutes actual consciousness, or is merely an advanced form of mimicry, we can't say for certain." I thought of Roy, of his voice coming from that thing's mouth. Was he still in there somewhere, still aware? "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you have a choice," Larson said. "You can walk away from this. We'll provide a new identity, relocation, financial support, whatever you need to start over. Most people choose that option. And the other choice? You join us. Help us understand these things. Find better ways to contain them. Protect others from them." I looked at the scars on my arm. 3 faint lines that would forever remind me of what I'd seen, what I'd lost. "It marked me," I said. "It will find me eventually, wherever I go." Larson nodded. Yes, but here, we might be able to protect you. Study the connection. Use it to our advantage. I made my choice that day, though not the one Larson expected. I didn't join their program, and I didn't accept their offer of a new life. Instead, I took what I had learned and disappeared, not running from the creature, but preparing for our next encounter. Because I understood something fundamental that Larson and his team did not. The observers weren't studying us out of scientific curiosity, they were hunting us. And the only way to defeat a hunter is to become one yourself. I returned to the wilderness, to the ancient forests where these creatures had stalked humanity since before we had names for our fears. I learned their patterns, their behaviors, their weaknesses. I became the watcher of the watchers. And somewhere out there, one of them is watching me in return. The one that took Roy, that bears my bullets in its ancient flesh. It's patient. It can wait decades for the right moment. But so can I. Sometimes at night, when the forest falls silent and the cold seeps into my bones, I hear the clicking, that bone-on-wood sound that haunts my dreams. And I know it's out there, moving among the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on the darkness. Watching. Always watching. And I whisper into the night, knowing it can hear me. I'm still here, I remember, and I'm waiting for you.